There we go.
There you go. I can hear you. Yep.
Yeah.
So how's it going?
Just kind of getting back and getting reorganized and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It was an interesting trip.
Yeah.
It's kind of I wouldn't say rich guy's way to see the world, but it's a little,
From a cruise ship?
we,
Yeah.
yeah, we haven't done, we've done, I mean, I've had a lot of travel experiences spending 3 weeks in Russia and all kinds of stuff, but that's with people
Mm-hmm.
and not, not from the safety and comfort of going back to our cabin on the ship
Right.
every night.
To your
But
stateroom. Yeah. Yep.
well, it's interesting because our experience was nothing like some people. It's called the Octavius. It's one of this. It's not a cruise ship. There's a smaller size. They call them expedition ships or something like that.
Mm.
And this boat with some of the people that were still on it started in the Great Lakes
Oh wow.
and come all the way down, go through. I mean, and
Good
these people have
grief.
been on the whole thing. I forget how many months they're actually on the boat, but and my wife would know the cost per person for that trip.
Yeah.
But so we're hanging out with these people, and they're going on to Antarctica. That's where it ends. We
Sure.
we we got Ushuaia. I think that's the way you pronounce it, and at the end of the tip of Chile, and then we flew to Buenos Aires and spent little time there, but they're
Mm-hmm.
still going down to, and
I
it's
suppose it's gonna be summer
a little
down
out of
there. They
my
might as well.
league. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's not quiet. I mean, it was the weather here and there is very similar right now,
Mm.
and so we had snow down there, and you guys had snow back here. So
Yeah. Yeah, we did. Yeah, a little bit.
yeah.
Yeah. It's yeah. So yeah, so there's a job
Where
at
are you actually at? Go ahead.
well, there's a job at Grand Forks. There's a job at Mankato. I
Oh,
think there's
good.
going to be a job at Mankato. I
Yeah.
haven't seen it. I've heard from somebody who's there, but I haven't seen a listing yet.
Yeah, so I looked up. I mean, I don't know if you got the last email. I looked up the department, and the one guy I know was, in fact, a chair at one time.
Mm-hmm.
James Macharik. He's a really good guy. The person I was concerned about is gone. So
Oh, good, good.
so and that's the only person I recognize in the whole faculty. The other thing I sent you, did you recognize that woman's name?
I did not know that.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
Because she seems really
into open.
involved in the OER stuff and
Mhm.
talks about going to conferences. So I thought maybe at a conference you would have crossed paths, especially
Yeah,
since you're in the
I
same
might.
region.
Yeah, I might have, but I didn't. Didn't recognize her.
Okay. And my only point with her was I can't tell you much about the department. I've been gone, 7, 8 years now. And like I said, there's only one name I even recognize. And he's an old guy. So I mean, he's not part of the new crowd. He's no longer the chair, et cetera. So
Right.
I was hoping that you would recognize, or she would, maybe you had an acquaintance there that could tell you what it's like now.
Yeah. I'm just trying to see if I can get on to. Let's see. Where's the job? I thought I saved the job posting, but in hear a lot of stuff in your background, Tim.
As the film title says, up in the air.
Hmm. Yeah, so I don't know what's gonna. I mean, I have to. As it turns out, I'm gonna have to write a tenure and promotion app in order to
Oh,
have bump privileges in the system if this
right.
job does come up
To
down.
go to Mankato, you mean?
Yeah, and then
How does that work? I mean, would you have an advantage looking in the
yes, they would have to actually, as I understand it, they would actually have to show cause to not hire me.
Wow.
Like my field was totally, out of the scope of what they needed or something like
Even
that.
as non-tenured, though.
Well, once I have tenure, yeah,
You can go through the tenure process even though there's not a job for you. Is that what you're saying?
I can. Well, I was going up. I was going to be going up for tenure anyway
This year?
this
Yeah.
year, right? So they encouraged me to do that so that I would have, so that if a job became available, I could claim it.
Yeah. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
and then I'd also be able to go in, as an associate instead of an
Sure.
assistant and at the higher rate and all of that,
Right.
and maybe even with tenure,
Right.
be hired with tenure. But yeah, I think the yeah, I think that actually might be relevant for me because I think the job that they are replacing down in Mankato is not exactly, right 100%
Sure.
overlapping my fields. Um, and so, although the one in Grand Forks is,
Yeah, that's what I
it's an
thought. Yeah.
American historian of the long 20th century,
Yeah.
which would be a nice fit for me.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, yeah, I don't know what to tell you about UND. I haven't been there. I've only been back once or twice since I left.
mm,
But there is an OER community there. There's, whatever you think of North Dakota and whatever,
mhm,
there's a big overlap with your professional interests.
yep. And I like Grand Forks.
Okay, good.
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah. I've always kind of enjoyed Grand Forks. I like Fargo too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not. I don't have as much experience, kind of west of there. But nobody lives west of there anymore. So I mean, I used to have a territory when I was working for a computer distributor. I used to have a territory that that was like North and South Dakota, and so I would occasionally drive out. I go to Fargo and then Jamestown and then Bismarck. I never really
Right.
got, I never got up to Devil's Lake. I never got to Minot. But I
Yeah.
did, in South Dakota, I did, of course, have to go all the way across to Rapid because that's where there was a lot of activity.
Distances in North Dakota don't mean the same things that they do here because my daughter was a good athlete, and in our league we would have to go as far as Jamestown on a
Sure.
Tuesday night for her to
Mhm.
play a ball game.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, it's just insane in a
Oh, and
blizzard.
that was just for the game, right? It wasn't like an
That was
overnight.
just a game, yeah.
Yeah.
When you come back in a blizzard,
Yep.
it's just
Just
crazy
a
stuff.
typical away game. Yeah. 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 I drove across, when I went to Edmonton, I drove across all the way, I actually drove through Devil's Lake, and that was my first time seeing it. And then I drove up to past Minot, and I crossed over at a tiny little place called Portal.
Yeah.
And then and I didn't come back exactly the same way, but yeah, I pretty much crossed, the northern section of North Dakota, and yeah, and it's interesting once you start seeing oil wells everywhere.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny because we were there long enough to go through the boom and bust of the oil patch. And then when the fracking came back in, it comes back up. And I mean, just crazy stuff over the
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
People living in any place they can find and having to chase them out of the parks because they were just, coming in and just kind of setting up camp and all kinds of weird stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. We, yeah, I don't, I didn't see any, of course I did see, the Enbridge headquarters in downtown Edmonton and stuff like that. They've got their big, logo on the top of their skyscraper. But I didn't see any, I mean, it's wheat fields all the way up. Yeah. And so, and I guess the tar processing is all, in the 100 to 200 miles north of Edmonton.
Yeah.
So, hey, Chris.
Morning.
How you doing?
We're awake and we're here. I'm just, appalled at the crazy end of this book.
Yes. Yeah, this
This third part was the best, I think.
I
Or
think it
the
was what
part
he
I
was
came for.
waiting to get to. Yeah.
And I still, other than a rhetorical setup, I still don't know why that first part was even there.
Mhm.
Other than maybe I wrote it at some point for some other book, and I thought it might work here, so let's throw it in.
Or my editor said I needed more. I needed balance. I needed, parallelism or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does. It serves a definite rhetorical device that's interesting and useful for people who are gonna, you know, who are skeptical.
Hmm.
But the problem is it adds a lot of bulk to a book that I don't think really needed the bulk there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Although speaking of bulk, that new thing that just came out 2 days ago, the notebook book is like 416 pages long. So I wonder what's in that because I wasn't able to
yeah.
get a view inside yet on Amazon.
Well, it's the guy's British. I'm pretty sure the publisher's British. The Kindle thing, when I last looked, it said it was not downloadable, but there was a notification on it saying it was a very large or an unusually large file size, which
Mm,
is usually Amazon code speak for there's pictures in here, and so it's going to take a while.
mm,
So I suspect that there are more images in it than a book like the one we've just read or
mhm.
that would have,
Right.
and it's more than just a couple of charts and graphs, but it's like, you
Okay.
know,
Like a coffee table book on coffee tables.
yeah, not, I don't think it goes that far, but you know,
Yeah.
for a hardback book of been, maybe, it's like the biographies that have a section of like 20 pages in the middle of
Right.
historical photos. So
Hmm. Hmm.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
So.
he's the guy has spent most of his life in publishing, as in I think I want to say it was in the editor, and he's written a few other things, but I don't think anything of this size and scope.
Mhm.
But I think he is like us. He is interested in this topic enough that I'm going to spend a couple of years and write a book on it. So
Right. Yep. Yep. Or dump out my settle costing.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I've been playing around thinking about, kind of the Zettelkasten stuff. I'm actually right now downloading my entire Obsidian folder from iCloud. Um, you have to if you have iCloud, you have to tell it to download it so that you can then duplicate it and copy it because it's getting flaky on me. Like it wouldn't just duplicate a folder. I guess I've given probably iCloud a longer leash than maybe they deserved in terms of trusting them. So now all of a sudden it's like I couldn't do what I wanted to do this morning, and I got really sort of mad and paranoid. So I'm going to back that up onto Dropbox, and maybe even just migrate once and for all onto Dropbox since I'm kind of paying for both, and Dropbox seems to be more dependable and stable and kind of does what it's advertised instead of thinking it's smarter than you and doing crazy Apple-ish things in the background.
yeah.
That's my initial take on that. I have been transcribing not the entire Syntopicon, but the index of the Syntopicon, which is this thing in the back. Uh,
Yeah.
and it has like for every um, keyword. These are all the keywords, and some of the and it actually lists how they all relate to sort of the major categorical keywords, the 102 words, right? And it actually tells you sort of which of them, like power. It says C, government 1D, justice 1A and 9F, law 1C, oligarchy 5C. And I'm not copying over the chapter and verse parts of it, but I am sort of copying over the categories so that I can see a graph, a network diagram, kind of how how all these things fit together, and how many things are sort of associated with each of these kind of major categorical keywords. And I'm not sure that that's really going to justify my time, but I'm doing it anyway, just for the hell of it. And then,
It sounds fascinating. I thought about doing it too, and then I was like, that's a lot of, you got to find the copy, cut and paste it, probably clean it up a little bit.
I'm just typing them.
Oh, you can. Somewhere I dropped a link for a digital copy of that thing, and you should be able to like just bulk cut and paste multiple pages. And
Yeah, well, I was using the advantage that I was taking advantage of was kind of the autocomplete part of the once you double bracket something, in Obsidian, you can just type in, HAP and it gives you happiness, if you've been using it already. So that has been a time saver. Now I'm like between 2/3 and 3/4 of the way through it, and I'm getting to the point where there are enough. In some of the cases, there are enough words that are close enough that like I have to type out mechanics in its entirety, in order to actually get it to do mechanics and not, mechanism and something else, or any of the other options that are in the list. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly what it's, what value it's going to have for me, other than, maybe kind of being an example of, this is a knowledge graph that these guys in the 40s and early 50s thought was cool and relevant, and spoke for an entire civilization, which is probably, the one time when, a group of people, kind of self-consciously did that. So it has some, some sort of historical value, even if it's, and it would, I guess, would also be interesting to know how much it has been superseded, and how much it needs to be adjusted now.
have you tried using it in a syntopical way for something you were interested in, like history or?
Well, I'm gonna, yeah, that's gonna be the next step, right? Yeah, I haven't done that yet.
I have started like delving through. There's some interesting overlap in their section on memory and some of the research I'm doing. So I have gone through and found some really fascinating little quotes and snippets from,
Yeah.
I don't even think he's in the main thing, but I found a quote, I think from Boethius, that was kind of interesting that would have taken me forever to find or see somewhere else.
Was that in the initial essay, or was it just in the things you might want to read that aren't included?
Oh, I think I just looked in the memory section and then just started skimming my way through chunks of what there was and what the overlap and where they point you to, and then selectively went and picked out a few of those quotes and tracked them down and read a section or two. But there were things that I hadn't found in some of the broad. So there are some people that I know who write about rhetoric and memory, and who either have read or have translated huge chunks of old Latin texts that would be super hard to find now.
Right.
And then, the level to which they study memory, especially in the Middle Ages, is really impressive. And there's only 3 or 4 people in the world who care enough to do that, which God bless them, because then I don't need to do it myself.
Yeah,
As rusty as my Latin is. But even in their compilations of stuff, there were things they didn't have in broad-based readers um, that were picked up there or pointed at there that would have been too subtle to notice, maybe.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's been fascinating to like find those little tidbits, but also at the same time too, there's the state of the art of what once was, even up to the 50s, with new new questions that show up. So on the philosophy fronts, they're still probably up to date, but questions like for this book, misinformation
right,
and how do you lie and what does a lie look like? How
right,
do you perpetuate that? There's not a lot that, although interestingly, I noticed, and I was doing some research a few weeks ago on lies and misinformation, and I dug up, I want to say it was a Swift quote from 1710, and I went back and found the Google Books scan of the original from a publication that I think ultimately became what is now known as the Spectator.
yeah,
Um, and then I was, intrigued to see Lipsky actually quote the exact same thing I had pulled up and read. Um, and it's a fascinating little piece of writing from the early 1700s that he could have written it today and put it on the New York Times, and other than some maybe stilted period language, it's
right,
totally applicable to
right.
today.
Yeah, yeah. It'll be interesting because the bulk of this, as we saw from that Life article, and I haven't tracked down the Look article yet, but the Life article was that you pointed out to us was 1948, right? So it suggests that that this was done really, probably beginning right at the end of the Second World War and ending, at the end of the 40s, and so this would be, I don't know when, like the prison notebooks were translated, but this is before a big part of of kind of what leads to our current understanding of of propaganda and hegemony and common sense, and all these all these ideas, and and really kind of post-structuralism and the postmodernism kind of broadly, and and in history, the new social history, I mean, you've got kind of the roots of what becomes the new social history in Nall's school and things like that in Europe. But I mean, even whoops, there we go, sorry, even like I think Thompson wasn't really. I mean, he's just like getting going in in England. So yeah, so I mean, so there's all this. Yeah, so I am looking forward to kind of looking at in detail at the history thing, and kind of updating it, and and seeing what what needs to be added to sort of the historiographical thing that they, and not being historians, I'm sort of fascinated what they think of sort of the role of history and the things that are important, from a more of a classicist's perspective. So yeah, thanks, Pat. I have looked quite a bit at the wiki stuff. It is interesting, that these as I've been sort of adding in all of these lesser keywords, right? There's like 1,800 lesser keywords that all map to these 102 that you put in the chat. And it's an interesting time capsule. And the thing, the thing to me, looking at it from the outside, and with a kind of a particular interest in secularism, is how religious this is. How much religion there is. I mean, yes, I mean, volume 1 begins with angels. It's the very first keyword, right? And so, and from there, it goes. I mean, I can't tell you how many entries God is referenced in. That link to the category, to the big, to the big category of God. I mean, there's a religion one, there's an immortality and eternity one that has that has a lot of religion in it. So it's interesting that there's a theology one. There's all these kind of threads running through that 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 over time it'll be kind of interesting to track down. And how all this stuff fits. I mean, up until very recently, I had thought I wasn't going to be a historian after May. Now I'm thinking maybe I will. So if that's the case, maybe, and if I'm at Grand Forks doing, the U.S. history of the long 20th century, this fits right in. So that might be, I don't know, that might be kind of fun. I'm sort of looking forward to that. If it works out, I have to write I never even really wrote a CV. Because I got the job at Bemidji State sort of accidentally right after finishing my PhD, so I've looked at other people's CVs and they're a little bit intimidating. I haven't been
padding.
Well, it's just weird, all of the, articles that people have contributed on and conference papers that they've done and places where they've said, I mean, if you say more than 5 words, in a row, you can put it on your CV, I guess. But yeah, I haven't really been, I guess, kind of keeping score. So I guess I'm going to have to sort of dig back and think, okay, well, I did talk at this thing, and I can, that can be it's just weird.
Well, you got like 4 million blog posts that really are each their own individual publication.
They're their own publication. Well, the one thing that I do have going for me is I do have a book in the Yale Agrarian Studies series. So that's something that, I mean, I was very lucky to get that. I was at the right place at the right time. My advisor, had an in, that I was able to take advantage of. But there's plenty of people who, are at my stage in their careers who don't have a monograph with a major press yet. So I guess that might be, that might make up in quality what I lack in quantity.
And you have one of the most popular OER textbooks on note taking that's out there.
One of the only.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and actually, I had pulled that down, sort of in my little peak of frustration, and then I haven't put it back up yet because I was thinking I want to update it. I want to make it about, about reading, note making, and writing, and then in a couple of years make it about reading, researching, note making, and writing. But I may just slap it back up there into the open textbook library because I don't want too much time to pass, with it not being available. Yeah. So anyway, there's a lot of crazy stuff in this section. In addition to, it was not Birdseye, it was Gorton that the Moonies took over in Gloucester. It was Gorton Seafood, but. Yeah, that's a crazy story, and I learned more about it than I knew, and probably more than I needed to know. What else?
Well, I love it. The thing for me, I think here, and from a rhetorical standpoint, that just works out almost stupidly well for him is it's now generally accepted that smoking is horrifically bad for you. And so he sets that up as here's the model of how to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
and let's use that model to create doubt about this new thing.
Right.
It's even better, like impossibly better. It's the same exact people on the overlap of those two.
And I think that's the value. That was the interesting thing, that sort of takes it above and beyond for me. The Naomi Oreskes, Eric Conway, the Merchants of Doubt story, right? Which kind of told the same story, but the thing that was cool about this was just sort of that moment where they say, well, okay, we need some kind of science thing that we can say, that we can try, that's more amenable to being debunked. Let's do climate. And it's just sort of this kind of weird target of opportunity that
Yeah.
that was remarkable to me, because I would not have guessed that.
Well, to make it a segue from your talk about the 102 great ideas, it is, and the what we've just read is that idea of coming to terms, because the Republicans of the time period used the phrase, what was the phrase? They use the phrase sound science.
Sound science, yeah, and junk
Why,
science.
we're going to believe in sound science, but then they never define that term and come to terms. So the big problem that their falsifications built on is the fact that they're using a term that's commonly used to mean one thing, and they're using it to mean something wholly else or wholly other.
Right. Well, and completely deliberately to muddy the waters, right? So it's exactly kind of the opposite of an attempt to actually come to terms. They're substituting, this thing. I mean, it's almost the definition of, sort of that line from The Princess Bride, right? I do not think it means what you think it means. Inconceivable.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, with the reading of that section with both Dr. Graham, who was very negative about the linkage, and the phrase from Mukherjee's book was something along the lines of, most people were sitting down when they were smoking, or worse to that effect. So do chairs have an effect or something? And then, of course, Graham suffers with it, and the junior doctor he was teaching and then was confessing to, Osher, Graham donated his body back to science so you can see another autopsy, because you were supposedly going to see one in a lifetime, and now within a couple of decades you're going to see nine in a row. And the numbers, a chapter or two earlier, where they were talking about Edison and Ford, because obviously they were in the original section, having stated pre and just after World War One that they won't allow smoking in the factories. You went from something like 20 million to 220 million users before World War II. And it's just, I can't deal with, we can't ban this, it's just too common. And then Mukherjee carries on elsewhere in the next chapter, I think, about now you have the problem of it is so common, it's beginning to become noise, not signal.
Yeah, well, and in World War II, I don't know if it I don't think it was in World War I, but in World War II, it's part of the kit, right, that they send to every soldier in the U.S. at least, and probably in other, probably other.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm pretty sure the World War One was mentioned in the book, and it was like 4 a day. But by the time you got Sinatra and Bogart doing their thing via Hollywood, you were up to something like 11 a day, right? Basically 1 an hour for you being awake.
Right, or a pack a day,
was was the comment. And then yes, and then it's not that long before you get films and or TV programs not poo-pooing it per se, but actually saying, "Oh, he's a real man or she's a real woman. She's a two-pack a man, two-pack a day person,
Yep.
or similar." And it's in the same sense of you get things like the likes of James Bond or other film heroes being commented on as being, "Oh, he's a 2 bottles of whiskey a day, man," as opposed to just a mere 14 pints of Guinness or whatever.
Hemingway.
So it's clearly being pumped much more than it would otherwise be. And now, of course, with all the sort of first world pushback, I mean, even here, you can't smoke here in almost any of the buildings,
Oh yeah.
in spite of the shisha,
Mhm.
in spite of the shisha type tradition. This shopping mall, which is Dubai's biggest, had four restaurants that had a glass box for shisha inside. They all got cancelled pre-COVID. So it's not even a reaction to COVID and all the other pollutions that we suffer. And other smaller shopping malls that had them when I arrived, they've all packed them up. All of the shisha is now outside, physically outside. So if it rains like it did last weekend, tough luck.
Yeah. We I mean, we had a rash of class action lawsuits on, about things like COPD in the last a decade or so ago, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, and they pretended, a lot of times that it was, it was mesothelioma or it was some, asbestos or, but, all of the, I mean, it's sort of like, anything respiratory in America, I think you can trace back to smoking, in the same way that, that all of these metabolic diseases, you can just trace back to.
I can't remember whether it's this book or one of the previous ones now. There was the same argument about asbestos, as in that's not a problem. In the same sense as you've had even the likes of Bill Gates drink a glass of sewage water after the treatment plant he's trying to push.
Mm-hmm. But Obama wouldn't do it in Flint.
No, I bet he wouldn't do it in Flint.
He didn't do it in Flint.
No, it was somewhere else. It was just normal sewage. It wasn't chemically. It was biologically active water. I mean, that's the thing. I can remember going around various waterworks in the UK,
mm-hmm.
where the two processes are side by side, because all the pipes go out and all the pipes go back, in effect. And you regularly get the waterwork management people saying, this is the water we're putting back in the river.
Yeah.
And he just puts a cup or a mug or a glass in the water flow and drinks it.
Yeah.
And it's like, the biggest risk is if you breathe it in, because that's the route for aeruginosa and Legionnaire's disease. Drinking it is fine. I mean, I'm a high risk person for Legionnaire's because I don't have a spleen. I've never really had a spleen. I find one out at 6 months old. And yet, part of my work is inside cooling towers, which is the thing to catch it for.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, with all the understanding of that through the UK particularly, you go back and look at the UK cases over the last 10 years, many of them have come from places that are not really associated with buildings. The classic case is the display paddling pool or the display garden pond in the garden centre with a bubbler, and people catch it from there because that water sits there for months because nobody's using it, are they? So why would I change it? Or why would I clean it up? And it's just sat inside a greenhouse, getting hot much of the time. And of course, Legionnaires wants warm water
Sure.
as opposed to cold water. And it's a big problem here. That's why they dose the domestic supplies so heavy here. And you just don't, you know, I had 5 years of testing every 3-4 months in 2 or 3 dozen places. And we never caught on it here. And so they just push it as much chlorine as they dare without changing the taste to it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have the benefit of it being higher in many cases because of the reverse osmosis. Walls to move up so much. But the other person that is a good read on the medical side is the other person I've referred to on occasion is Ben Goldacre. Well, and he's Big Bad Pharma book as a starting, as in how to control the research, as in don't let anybody publish any negative results. Don't let anybody publish any full results, such that there's always sort of wiggle room, etc., etc. And some of the stuff he picked up and explained and expanded on, it was a wonder that anybody, if you read the book, why you would trust the doctor to tell you about an ingrown toenail, him included, because of course he's a medical researcher as well.
Yeah.
And but I haven't managed to digest his latest book, which was something along the lines of it's a little more complicated than that.
Oh, that's
as opposed to it's
yeah. Well, you know, and you know, to kind of what you're saying, Tim, you know, part of one of the keynotes at the conference that I was at in Canada was by a guy by the name of Cable Green, who is one of the founders of Creative Commons, and he's still their executive in charge of something, open education or something, and it was about open research publishing, right? And you know, sort of breaking free of the you know, of the major presses like Elsevier, right? That control all these scientific and other academic journals. And the reason that they were doing it specifically, you'll find this interesting, Tim, was that Creative Commons has decided that what they are going to focus on strategically for the next several years are 3 elements of the UNESCO Sustainability Goals document, which is like 45 or however many goals, but it's numbers 13, 14, and 15. And 13 is climate, 14 is life, animal life, plant and animal life on land, and I think 15 is plant and animal life under the water. And you know, so they, you know, so this is kind of their strategic focus, and what they've decided is that this is one that really needs openness, right? Because they, you know, between 1980 and 2020, there have been 169,000 articles dealing with climate, and 53% of them are behind very, very high paywalls, right? So, you know, so that most people can't afford to even look at them. Right. And, you know, and so that's, so I think that's kind of an interesting element of that sort of, you know, that question. I mean, it's much easier to do peer review if you've got these big walls and you've got this complete lack of transparency and visibility of what's going on, you know, in these scientific publishing organizations. I also wanted to say something about the book. One of the things I was kind of impressed with again is just sort of the wealth of detail that he manages to find to just jam into these paragraphs about people, right? Like that, you know, John Hill. I think he's talking about John Hill at this point at the beginning of the chapter on genetics. right? And he's talking about
Yeah.
he's talking about the Scots Terriers and um, and all these kind of weird things. The youngest president. Oh, it's maybe it's Clarence Cook. But and then but then occasionally it goes off the rails, right? He talks about Mount Desert Island, right? This is the Daniel Defoe sounding Mount Desert Island. Mount Desert Island is where Acadia National Park is. It's Bar Harbor, Maine. It's it's not a Daniel Defoe desert island at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to go back on your number 14, 15, and 13, there are only 17 sustainable goals.
Oh, I thought there were more than that.
No. There's only 17.
I've always been focused on number 4, so I guess I never read further.
Oh, number 4 is quality education.
Yes, yeah. That's where and all the OER work that like OE Global does falls under that.
Yeah. But you were talking about climate one is 13, life below water is 14, and life on land is 15.
Okay.
Got the sequence slightly wrong, but we're all in the same, 13, 14, or 15, so we're all at the end of the listing. And the other thing with those, of course, is climate-wise particularly, they have got, particularly on the climate and what to do about pollution and biodiversity, they're all the same set of tipping points that come out of Potsdam. So when you see those pie charts with all the slices, the 9 slices of the 9 major tipping points, and whether the orange bar is crossed over the green line or not, they all pretty well match one or two of those 17 UN goals. So they do overlap. So they're worth tracking as a group.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got, I was just amazed. I was trying to track all the names and didn't quite finish tracking all the names of the bad boys versus the good guys, as it were. And I wasn't quite sure where we would put Mukherjee anyway, as opposed to he's just another author like David is for this book. Or is it more like Golda, or more like Naomi as being an activist in that section?
Mm-hmm.
As to then think about who's talking about Hanson's recent paper this week or last week that picks up on his 1980 and the other papers issued. And there's been a couple of papers I noticed where they've said, let's go back and check his results. And they've all come out well within the error bar as being correct. As a paper, it's just the journalism that's associated with that paper that doesn't quite match the error bar, as it were. But then you also talk about the paywall and the controllability via the big publishers. And when I was still at Bath at uni, and not long after I stopped being at uni, that was all Robert Maxwell's Pergamon Press. So there was one more big name in the European market that was Pergamon, but then got taken over, partly because it then turns out, of course, that our supposed very left-leaning boss was naughty boy with Mossad and others, and not quite as left-leaning as you think. And then committed suicide off his boat. So,
and where did all that money go?
Where did all the money go? I mean, he just took the pension fund with him. And probably spent it on fuel for pushing the boat.
Yeah, that's a whole. Yeah, it's interesting how if you track names, how
almost as good as follow the money.
it gets weird very quickly.
And
Hill and Knowlton has a great role in this. I was happy to see, as much them getting as much credit for what they did
and
as.
the other thing that I've noticed I've probably got about the first third, 40% names cross joined, is are there people specializing in tracking the falsehoods by which bunch of bands? And it's a bit like you get those who want to be anti-Chomsky. How fast do they jump on that latest speech from Chomsky or something? Or those that want to jump on Naomi Klein rather than Naomi Ostases, etc.
Mhm.
How much of these people in both directions are becoming slightly specialized to make sure they catch as much as they can catch rather than just do an open Google search once a week or something. And it's worthwhile seeing, are there particular individual fistfights going on rather than just one side versus another.
Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein actually,
Yeah.
in a kind of sort of a strange twist. Naomi Klein was the speaker at my daughter's graduation at their graduation ceremony at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, on Mount Desert Island. So there you go, full circle. In 2015.
That's awesome.
So no coconuts.
No coconuts at all.
All Man Fridays.
The other question too is was maybe he's making the point that Defoe's Island wasn't as empty as the story made it out to be. Maybe he was making the opposite.
Well, it's not. It certainly wasn't. I mean, I got the implication that, well, this guy was, he had sort of retired to this remote place. But Bar Harbor, Maine is not that remote from centers of power and from academic or government.
Well, it's not downtown Manhattan either, so
right. Yeah.
But within the modern world or a modern person's framing, it's
you take a ferry. I mean, the easy way is you take the ferry to Boston and then get on a train. So yeah. So there are a lot of the Harvard connection was interesting to me too. In this, these first what is it? I think they're not numbered, but this first class simple annihilation. This whole.
Oh, Mike, one of my favorites was there was a reference to some researcher was like a Harvard scientist, and neither was he a scientist nor did he go to Harvard yet. The news presented him that way as, so it's even
the proto Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, or there's like misinformation going on at multiple levels. There's the general muddying of the waters, but it's the outlets that are willing to let small stupid stuff like that go on their air without fact checking it or any pushback of any sort. And I don't even think he gets into ideas like the Gish Galaf in this, because they're pushing back in different ways. So even at the level of, you mentioned gatekeepers like Elsevier and doing open science, so it's easier for the average person to get the research. But the problem is, even if I could get the most technical journal articles on climate science, unless I've got, I happen to have an engineering and science background that's solid enough, I could probably read those journal articles and tease them apart to figure out what the subtle details are. But the average Joe on the street's not going to be able to do that. So
Well, and it's going to go by titles and abstracts and what publication they appear in, right?
Yeah, but it's it's having somebody like a Naomi Oreskes who's willing to go through and do the work and compile the massive list of here's all the stuff in evidence for this thing, and I can't in any of the literature find any scientific research that underpins the other side's story.
Mm-hmm.
But even in a book like this, when I read that, my gosh, I need to have that reference right now, but I can't even find the footnote. I have to go online. I have to match what I'm reading, in fact, when I heard it first because I listened to the audio version before I read it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, oh, I want that right now. But even doing a quick Google search for it and knowing which site I'm searching for to find that footnote, Google would not kick it up to me instantaneously.
Oh, wow.
So I literally had to pin it so that when I came back to it and read it in digital form, I'm like, okay, I know which chapter I'm in now. I can go find the footnotes and find that thing. But the ease of doing it, there literally are so many steps from here's this thing that you want, and how can you go verify it?
Right.
Is more, was almost more work than it's worth, unless you're like me, you really want to have the thing and you want to be able to read it. And most people aren't. They're just going to either take it on faith that the person who said it sounds like they have, some kind of standing in the field.
Mm-hmm.
So you give your armchair a corporate address and you say it's the National Science Foundation for X, Y, or Z. And
it's not the National Science Foundation, though. It's the National Science Federation.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other NSF.
But it's having somebody like this who can put all those puzzle pieces together, spanning, a century and more of detail.
Yep.
Like, the evening news almost never even gets 5 minutes to spend on a tiny piece of the story, much less, I honestly, if I had FU money, I'd be like, okay, I want to option this book and let's go turn it into the documentary.
Yeah.
To make it easily watchable.
Right.
If you think along those lines, you then need to go back and see The Corporation, which was a book and a documentary simultaneously from day one. And on the upside of that, there are industrialists that have effectively switched sides, such that one of them is a carpet tile manufacturer, and they decided to do pretty much what Patagonia's done, as in, we want to lower the impact of the business and we want to spread the ownership of the business within the workers, not just stock market investors. So they've been buying back external stock and they've been selling it on, giving it away and bonuses, etc. But also changing the processes that they do. So that those processes don't link pollution in quite the same way. And I mean, Patagonia, 15 odd years ago, literally created the organic cotton market that said no pesticides. And cotton, even though it's not a food crop, is still the most densely pesticide crop outside of North. You know, even with the amount of stuff that's in the organic market. And now, of course, Patagonia is pushing to get commercial hemp growing back at a scale that has processing plant to make more fabric. We're going to start seeing more hemp fabrics coming out of Patagonia, and presumably, therefore, the other outdoor sporty wear, stroke hard wearing, outdoors worker stuff.
Right.
Which in theory can only be good for the environment, in theory, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, depends how it's done. Yeah, there is a lot of there's a lot of stuff in here. You know, maybe he is hoping that this will be optioned, because there's a lot of stuff in here that would be sort of amenable to documentary, to visual kind of representation. I'm just, kind of scrolling through all these little mini chapters. Junk science. Yeah, I think it was interesting that he quotes, Naomi's Merchants of Doubt, saying, perhaps not surprisingly, the same people who defended tobacco now attack the science of global warming. I mean, that does seem inevitable, and it was, and she demonstrated that well enough. I think this additional thing that he does, though, that is really valuable, this idea that that this was something that they chose because it would make the science. You can't do that with, by the time they started doing it with climate change, it was too late. You couldn't do that with cigarette smoking. So that's brilliant when you think about it.
The other thing too that I kind of wonder, and it becomes a bigger political football to maybe try and pull off, but in cases where one side or another says, "Oh no, it's not this, it's something else," particularly when it's backed by a business like big oil or big tobacco, if they're saying, "Oh, this science is bunk and it's not true," then there should be a mechanism by which we can force, or should be able to force them to put their, feet to the fire and say, "Well, if that's true and you say that it's not, you should be willing to indemnify us against those effects. So put up some money, and put your money where your mouth is, essentially, to prove it. And then if it turns out, then sure, you get a windfall profit, because 20 years from now, or if you're I always thought, if you're a mining company, and if we could force the CEO of the mining company to live in the town where the mining is happening,
Yeah.
and or embargo chunks of their profits, for long-term investments,
Mm-hmm.
then when it turns out it's a big slag heap and it requires $1 billion to, mitigate the environmental cost, there's actually some money there. But the problem is, in almost all these cases, you're extracting out, in cigarettes, originally it was cents per cigarette that you're taking out.
Mhm.
And over the long term, it's causing multiple millions of dollars of healthcare costs and issues that then get put back on the people. So the value you're extracting is out of society
Mhm. Yeah.
that then is paying for the long-term cost itself, which just means you're siphoning off value for individuals who walk away with it. It's not even the corporation, because the corporation can declare bankruptcy, and the
Right.
individuals who ran it, are, hey, it's hard to, for something like in the case of the Sacklers, to claw that money back.
Right.
You can bankrupt the corporation, but it's how do you also go bankrupt the individuals who stole all the money to begin with?
Well,
And
you could, but nobody has the political will to do that. And partially I think it's part. I think mining is actually a good way to think about this because mining often happens very far away, often in other nations, right? Often in less developed nations, right? So that was a way of sort of hiding those externalities, right? Was have Rio Tinto's mine be that's killing all these people and creating all this slag that's running off into water supplies, be in some part of Africa that nobody cares about. Um, Nowadays, for the first time, that is starting to happen to us, right? So the mine that the copper mine that they wanted, the sulfate mine that they wanted to put in northern Minnesota between Lake Superior and the Boundary Waters um, was run by a company called Polymet, which was really just a front company for Glencore Xstrata, um, which has a long history of doing these things in, having horrible, horrible mines in third world countries, like in Africa and places like that. And now all of a sudden, this is sort of in a really kind of weird irony. It's sort of turnabout for Americans who were content to allow that to happen, and our pension funds or our 401ks or whatever, or our institutional endowments, right, that were invested in these types of things, were profiting from that, and that was going to help us, live the good life. And now in a turnabout, they're doing it to us, if we happen to live, someplace not particularly heavily populated, but with some type of environmental value, like the Boundary Waters. Um, so yeah, it's yeah, it is, and it totally is. Yeah, privatizing profits and socializing losses. And that's been, yeah, that I mean, those two elements of modern corporate definition, right? Immortality and limited liability, I think, are really, really big elements of enabling that.
yeah, corporations shouldn't be able to act as people,
Yeah.
or if they do, we need to do a better job of holding corporate leadership accountable to the issues of the corporation itself. It's rare that you find, unless it's just massive fraud, like the Elizabeth Holmes case, or this week's Sam Bankman-Fried, when it's just a super obvious fraud.
Mm-hmm.
But most corporations protect themselves against it, so it's hard to go after Enron, let's say,
Yeah.
because they're much more savvy about how to legalize the corporate shield part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
obviously, Sam Bankman-Fried had no idea how to do that.
Right.
much
Well, and
less.
there's a guy who wrote. There's a business historian. God, where is he? He's somewhere in this pile of books. Can't find him right now. There's a guy who wrote a book called Managed by the Markets, and he wrote several articles as well. And he's not really a historian. He's sort of an economic sociologist, I think. And he wrote a lot about the way that mutual funds and then hedge funds, but especially mutual funds in the the 70s, 80s, 90s, that have changed the way that corporate governance was done, so that you no longer had investment bankers like J.P. Morgan and Company, right, who had a person, Gerald Davis, thank you, and who had seats on boards, right, and could influence an interlocking, you couldn't have antitrust law and the New Deal kind of eliminated interlocking directorates in corporations, except that a banker could still sit on many boards, right? So that was like the exception to the rule that was in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, that was made really on behalf of J.P. Morgan and Company, so that they could continue having their web of directors out there in the world. But that was really kind of eliminated by all of this retail mutual fund stock ownership, where people didn't pay any attention, right? Because I've got Fidelity Magellan, and it's got it's $1 billion fund, and it's got it's got thousands of investments, and I can't keep track of it all, right? And I don't have to keep track of it all, right? Because Peter Lynch is a genius, and he's going to keep track of it, right? But Fidelity, they didn't exercise, even when they owned large, and by large, I think in this sense, you would be thinking of between 1% and 5% ownership stake would be considered large in a corporation. So they didn't really exercise any type of control. Sometimes they got board seats, but they weren't really activist board members. But then the next step was, right, then you had Vanguard, right, which are just which kind of became as big as Fidelity, and it's all in index funds, right? So there's not even a manager. There's not even any active, nobody's paying attention, right? So you've got these.
It's like, how many levels of administration can you put between the wrongdoing and the way it's funded to make it harder? And it's the same thing that is happening in the science in this book, is how many levels between the deep hard science that's not easily accessible by the masses, and the further you get away from that, the harder it is. And it's a topic that comes up for us an awful lot, is the idea of information overload. You can only see and follow and process so much information, and or have the ability to track it down, much less believe someone else who does have that time. Are they telling you the truth or not? And it's become even worse in the last 5 or 6 years, is the mainstream media telling us the truth? So can you trust that or not? And that is now questioned by a huge number in the populace. That there's a huge amount of data out there to support all this stuff, but I got to feed the kids, and I'm going to go to McDonald's instead of reading Naomi Oreskes. So
Right. Well, and not only that, but he does a good job of showing how, in many cases, mistakes just get amplified and continued, right? This Monbiot, finding on my Kindle 273, right? That the new scientist has had 555 of all the 625 glaciers have been growing since 1980. Oops, not 555, but 55. And yet it's misinformation that won't die.
Yeah.
And there's a lot. I mean, I think that's way more prevalent.
And in terms
of
and
science.
in terms of mainline media that you believe, that is mainline is because it is in front of you more often than not. You end up with Fox News, or in UK's terms, you end up with the Daily Mail. I mean, the Daily Mail original owner, goes to Berlin to shake Hitler's hand and then comes back and says he's not a Nazi, right? He's even got photographs of him doing it himself on his own, in his own newspaper. But
who was the original Daily Mail owner?
Northwich. Yeah, Northwich.
Can't hear you.
So this is, pre and post Munich, remember it? And they've not changed. The same family still owns it in that sense. And it's like, those editors that used to work for top end papers that are in the Murdoch folder source just move around out of Murdoch into somewhere else and come back. And the normal comment about the military complex and the revolving door between DoD people and the contractors is exactly applicable to the major editors across what used to be called the Fleet Street newspapers, and yet none of them are in Fleet Street anymore, except the Guardian, I think, for them. And I was about to say with Chris and his comment about can you trust the media, and you mentioned Monbiot, and of course he's featured in the Guardian. They do, at least where there is a quote type comment or a reference, actually link you to that where they're coming from. Unlike this book, albeit we have to go back online and find it, and as you say, the best solution to that is you make a shortcut of the page and keep it on your desktop or in your browser or browsers even. But the Guardian, particularly when you look at some of the stuff on climate, is self-referring. It's going back to not just the Guardian stuff, but the Guardian stuff by the current journalist in a lot of cases. But that doesn't come out unless you follow the link. It's not like, and I said in December last year, blah, 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 whatever. It's just the statement in whatever color your browser gives it. And you touch it and you go back to another article by the same person. Or at least most of the time you go back to another Guardian article. So going back to original sources, a bit like you and your Substack in a lot of cases, is still at least one or two or three more steps to go. Because they just self-refer. So to get to the original piece on Plymouth University on microplastics or something, is still 2 or 3 or 4 steps back. It gets there eventually in most cases, but
you don't get the good SEO juice if you don't self-refer. So it's all about the almighty dollar.
Yeah, I understand why they do it. Right, I fully understand why they refer back to their own article as a collective family or their own article in as an individual to get links and coverage and all the rest of it. But is that not just as bad? That's not necessarily the greatest of reasons, but as you say, you couldn't find David Lipsky's thing on the top 10 of Google links. But
Well,
I haven't had to do it. I haven't had to do it more than once because I saved it.
yeah. Well, and that's a question that I have actually about because I'll mention it now because I thought about it the last time. I think Chris, when you mentioned Google, are we trusting Google anymore? And in the same, and I guess in the same sense, Tim, are we trusting the Guardian anymore? I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, I was like, yeah, George Monbiot in the Guardian was like the go-to guy. I remember he and there was a guy who wrote about Simon Fairley wrote a book about meat eating, and it was called Meat, a Benign Extravagance. And he had this sort of long-running argument, and this would have been about 10 years ago, with between Fairley and Monbiot, in kind of in the pages of the Guardian, and then Fairley wrote this book about it, about this new model of sort of cattle raising, on grazing land, and in this new kind of this new format, because Monbiot would have said everybody should eat, everybody should become a vegan, I guess, at one point. And I remember that. I remember having some kind of level of confidence in the Guardian at that point. In the last 5 years, it seems like that has changed dramatically. And so what do we do about sort of that changing, kind of the changing nature of these sources that we used to trust, like Wikipedia as well?
But I mean, Monbiot's an oddball case where he's got obviously the general green climate thing. He's particularly got the meat eating side, and then he goes up against the likes of James Savoy or Nicholas Savoy, the original sort of African-based guy for the regen agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
That Monbiot turns around and says it's never been scientifically proven, but Savoy or Savory says, but look at the examples, and it's like it's no longer is it my backyard. It's these 45 projects of 1,000+ acres each now have output and virtually no chemical input, and yet because it's not written up in a peer review, it's not science. And yet other halves of Monbiot is pointing out all the corruption of the peer review process at the other end of it. So he argues against himself from week to week in some respects, albeit not necessarily on directly overlapping nth degree example. But the process, he argues against himself a lot from 1 month to the next. And it's now, I think, we've got somebody recently did another, let's see what the reproduction rate is for some of the more harder sciences. If you exclude the sort of the so-called conspiracy come lucky Jake and ignore the social sciences a bit, how far down the reproducibility line does the slightly harder sciences go to being full hard, astrophysics or atomic particle type CERN based physics? And that count is not as great as it could be still. It's not 100, it's still a long way off 100%. Or even a sort of like a decent 80+%. So, and then of course, if you say that you believe Monbiot, do you believe in all aspects, or do you say let's just stick with certain areas? You take it
Well,
that he's
I don't
correct
believe
there.
I don't believe anybody, but I think that some people, sort of bring up interesting topics and look at them in interesting ways, and that I'm willing to, sort of spend some time reading, I guess would be my kind of reaction to that.
So how many we've commented about this book and of course the previous one by Winchester, if I remember right, didn't have rates within the published book, proper references, footnotes, endnotes,
Uh-huh.
bibliography type stuff. And I commented the same about Hope Jardine's recent climate overlap with Naomi Orestes and people like Catherine Hayhoe.
Uh-huh.
Yet, how many of the Big Myth original comics did any of us actually go back and read all of those papers?
Right.
Or the whole paper on any one point? Probably none of us.
Right.
Right? We might have gone back and read the abstracts that gives us a little bit more than what Naomi and Eric gave us in the Big Myth. And we take another step back and go back to the American myth, or even Piketty and stuff, how much of that did we go back and check? Because there's just too much information.
Yeah.
At some point, you say, on balance, this person is rarely wrong, as opposed to, we think this is also the area that they are not maliciously wrong. Whereas, with Monbiot, it's meat, as far as I can see. He's so now anti-meat that he won't entertain that. If you want a wholesale ecology for farmland, forget about the rewilding land for a minute. What are you going to do? You're just going to use purely plant-based compost?
Right.
Then how do I get all the wildlife, all the animals out of the compost?
Uh-huh.
How many earthworms am I allowed to trample on before I become a meat eater? It makes no sense, because the system, as natural system as we can get, needs some animal base in the system, because we're not the only animal there.
Uh-huh.
We should never be the only animal there. So if you look at some of the permaculture stuff from the likes of, say, Jeff Law, he's got market garden / food forest, but he makes his compost via a chicken run.
Uh-huh.
Because it's less work for him.
Yeah.
But it still gives him decent compost, and it also gives him some chicken meat and lots of eggs.
Some of it is, looking at what the person's area of expertise is, which is one of the issues I have with the first section of this book is he's obviously enough of an expert to write about all these inventors and do it in a reasonably interesting and deep manner, which gives him some base of expertise. But to me, he's spent way more time reading and researching and looking into the history of the climate science stuff. I am much more likely to believe what he says about that. But how far will I let him go? So, and I'll give you 2 examples of things that I found interesting in this book, but that I'm not sure and he doesn't go into them deeply enough that I'm sure I would believe him. So he talks about the researcher who looked at mercury in fish when it became an issue in the 70s, and he went back and he dug up samples of fish, them for mercury, and said, oh, roughly it's about the same.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll take that at face value as state of the art in the 70s, but I'm not 100% sure, and I wouldn't believe that little story as a modern day thing because my presumption is we've been dumping a lot more mercury into the environment than we were doing in the 70s. So maybe that science has changed since then. So I'm not going to take this particular piece of the book on face value for that piece.
Yeah.
Another one in this section that we just read this week is Linus Paulding's like fascination with vitamin C. Now, every mother in America, if you start getting sick, oh, go out and take your vitamin C. Here, have an orange. Here, you know, there's even a thing called Emergen-C, the letter C, as a product. And, you know, or a decade ago in the early 2000s, you started to get sick and everybody said, oh, go take echinacea. Why am I taking echinacea? It's you know, it's the old housewives' tale of you know, don't go out without a coat on because you'll catch your death of cold, or you know, don't go out with wet hair. It happened once, so somebody died, and now everybody does this because of anecdotal evidence. But
well,
so on
I
those
take
two
zinc and
topics,
D.
on those two topics, he doesn't give me enough information. He essentially is supporting what, or in one case, in the mercury, is contradicting something that most people would think, oh, yeah, there's a lot of mercury in fish. We shouldn't eat a lot of fish. And he's contradicting that in a way that makes me think I got to look into it more deeply. Versus the vitamin C thing is such a everybody everywhere knows about vitamin C, or they think they do. And it was interesting to me to see, oh, it was Linus Paulding's influence that maybe helps tip that into the zeitgeist that it's a thing everybody just believes now.
Oh, I completely remember when that happened. Yeah, I mean, my mother was like an early reader of Prevention magazine. You know, it was the Rodales who kind of pushed that. Oh, you know, mega doses, you know, gram plus daily doses of vitamin C, and that was huge in the 70s. One of the things that I think kind of goes along with that, but where the science changes, as you're saying, Chris, I think he makes a better case for is sort of this continuity of ill intent. You know, this section where he's talking about this guy Jim Tozy, right? Who is the villain in the Rise syndrome. You know, I mean, he goes back and he finds such just monumental, you know, these guys should be burning, you know, or freezing in the ninth. I think the ninth circle is ice, right? They, you know, but or up to their necks in manure or something. In one of the circles of hell, you know, that, you know, and then he just, you know, and they just continue to recycle themselves, doing the same thing in in apple cider vinegar, yeah, with a little what is it, activated charcoal on the side.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Well,
sure.
here's the problem too: is you can go to your family physician, who presumably would have some expertise in this area, and you're going to find a huge. You sample 500 physicians, and they're all going to have different viewpoints on it. Some good, some Dr. Oz. My other favorite too. There was a mention of, you know, a home remedy that essentially, what was it, like a sheep tincture or something? It reminded me of some of the things one should take to prevent COVID.
The ivermectin.
You know, the ivermectin sort. I'm like, oh my God, like these crazy people are just this, you know, there's some core here for crazy. But I thought that was an interesting, and I was surprised he didn't actually make an ivermectin nudge there. But even your family physician, who is supposed to be doing continuing education and looking at these things, they don't have the time to sit down and look at, new vitamin C research. And in large part, they're going on the same zeitgeist, Linus Paulding information from 2 generations back
Right.
to make a lot of their home remedy recommendations versus using actual, this is how science works. Um,
Hmm.
I even at the base level, it is patently obvious that huge amounts of bacteria transfer in a hospital is the result of not washing one's hands.
Oh yeah.
And yet you can go to any hospital today and sit in a bed and a doctor will come in and check you out. And they are supposed to wash their hands when they enter the room and again as they leave the room. But they do that in practice? Does your physician do that in practice when they walk into your exam room? I've been watching for a decade, and I think maybe twice in about 15 visits have I seen a physician wash their hands when they walk in the room to see me. You know, and then that's not counting like, eye doctors who aren't actually touching or doing something specifically to put their hands physically on me. Or
Hmm.
even weird things like most doctors now don't wear ties in clinical settings because the tie touches everything in their environment. You lean over something, your tie hits it. And at least the guys here know, who probably none of us wear ties, but how many times in your lifetime have you dry cleaned or had a tie washed?
Never.
Yeah.
Unless it has a nasty stain on it and it's your favorite tie and you want to save it.
And it
You
never
never
works.
wash ties. And you know,
Yeah, the
so
first time you do that is the last.
the only thing saving the bacteria going from one tie spot to the next is fashion changed so dramatically. I have to get rid of this wide tie and buy a skinny tie now because
Right.
it's not in
That
fashion.
that's why Lancelot Sprat has a waistcoat and a tie pin.
Hmm.
So if you go and see the 1950s, early 60s British comedies on medical,
Hmm.
uh, Doctor in the House and Doctor on the Go, etc., then the surgeon, as opposed to the physician, who rules the roost in the hospital back then via the matron, Spat has a waistcoat always and a jacket on. Right.
I always thought the
So
surgeons
that
weren't
if
even.
it's not,
I always thought the surgeons in the UK didn't even want to be called doctor. They were just called Mister. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
because they're not doctors, they're surgeons.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's one up from a barber.
Yeah. Right. The bloody pole. Yeah.
Yeah, stripy pole.
Yeah.
If not the stripy pole, then it's Sweeney Todd.
Right. So
I mean,
so what about the, I mean, so we were talking about the discrediting of information sources, Wikipedia, Google, the Guardian. What about this? I mean, what happens now? I mean, I imagine he, substantially wrote this before the science was discredited in America by, people like Fauci and Peter Hotez and all these nutballs. What do we do now with that? Because I mean, personally, I do think that the science has been largely discredited. Just with all of this, the good lie.
I'm expecting the proof to arrive next week for the fact that the Earth is flat.
There you go.
So
Well, and Tim, you mentioned indigenous science. One of the things that, in an effort to be as woke as is humanly possible, at this conference that I was at, everything began with, drumming or saging or land acknowledgement. and which I don't disagree with up to a point. But then when you start talking about indigenous epistemology and indigenous ways of knowing, how do you do that? And maybe this is a question for you, Chris, because you're into this stuff. How do you do that critically? How do you do that and just not say, okay, it's completely subjective and the loudest voice in the room wins?
I mean, there was a comment about the current Israel-Gaza thing, where there was a Welsh named guy talking about how bad the Britons were against the Welsh pre-Roman times. And it's like, yeah, okay, maybe, but there's no written records. So how do you know? And it's like the sheer number of things that are very consistent in some respects, you know, in the Stone Age and pre even Homo sapiens. You know, you get there's a up in wherever the border between Kenya and Ethiopia, there are tons and tons of part-made spearheads and axes that made that axe that was first made by pre-Homo sapiens and then continued by Homo sapiens were for millennia made in this area and exported around, you know, what must have been most of northeastern Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, how much has changed? Where's the development? Where's the evolution? And they're now coming up with the 6,000-odd-year-old man that was in the Austrian glacier.
Oh,
They've
Ötzi.
redone the DNA, and he's now not white; he's black.
He's brown at least.
So, yeah, but okay. But brown here would imply sort of South Asian as opposed to African.
Anatolian was what I heard.
Yeah, but that doesn't make him Turkish, and it's after.
Well, no, because there were different people
before.
there at that time. Yeah, 5,000,
Absolutely,
6,000 years ago.
And it's like, so at what point do you say who owns the land? Which was where the Gaza Israeli thing was going. And it's like, you know, and I'm even part Welsh. So am I part Welsh via the British bit, the Britain bit going into Wales because it got pushed out by the Romans? Or am I Welsh on the bit that sent St. Patrick over to get rid of the snakes out of Ireland? You know, good people that we are.
Yes.
So
well, somebody had to get the snakes out. Damn it. but there was a comedy. There was a satire piece that was posted last week on Substack. That was the Windex declaration. The Windex company, you know, the glass cleaner, on the Israel Gaza thing, and basically they said 10,000 BCE, the Nabateans or somebody, they're the people who own the land. So everybody else, you know, your claims are null and void.
Here's the thing: is in most indigenous conceptualizations, they don't even own the land. You're the stewards and the safekeepers of the land, not for you now, but for your children and your grandchildren, you know, 10 generations hence. So, and I, you know, going back a little to Dan's question about the, you know, there definitely is an over indigenization and virtue signaling going on in a lot of these spaces, which I think is not good, it's not practical, and it's not helpful. So if you're burning sage at an event, unless it is an indigenous person who has that as a practice and they're doing it, you're you're really co-opting a practice
Right. Oh, it was. It was indigenous.
in a really harmful way, because you don't know what you're actually doing, or more importantly, why you're doing it.
Yeah.
And in almost every case, when you dig into, and I will say indigenous science with a capital I and a capital S, and not indigenous science with a lowercase I and scare quotes around science the way Tim did, because if you look at the practices that happened and occurred, they almost always had an underlying reason why.
Mhm.
So things like when you're planting your farm, you will plant some things here and you'll go a couple miles away and you'll plant some things there and some somewhere else, so that if there's a flood or some weird thing, the entirety of your crop is not wiped out. In modern agriculture, you'll plant hundreds of acres all in one spot and you don't care, because you're doing it at such mass scale. You'll come out okay. But if you're an indigenous person living 10,000 years ago and planting crops or tending crops of any sort, you don't have that luxury, and a famine is going to wipe you and your family or your entire village or tribe, or how it may only be 10 or 20 people, but you're all going to be dead.
Right. Right.
Because you don't have the backup. So those practices mean something.
Right.
And most people, a lot of the reasons why those things happened are lost, but they all had a reason.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because it was indigenous people. Although it's kind of weird because in Canada they for all intents and purposes kind of consider Métis people to be indigenous as well. And it was interesting because they also mention what treaty area they're in, which I found really interesting. And it was and Edmonton was in Treaty 6. But the question of who is there when and whose protocol, right? Because they were talking about all these protocols, right? You have you give you give tobacco to, and that's a kind of a universal one, as a gift, as a way to honor the person who you're going to ask a question. And there was a guy who was saying, I'm perfectly willing to answer questions, if people follow the right protocol. But again, whose protocol wins in a situation where there are multiple indigenous groups with slightly different identities and histories and things. It's like the people who tried to claim in the Pacific Northwest, who tried to claim the remains of Kennewick Man, right? It turned out that they were not genetically related even remotely to those remains. So, why should it be given to them?
It's clear with the sheer turnover of people moving around, that it's very difficult to actually who was here first, and that's at some point you've got to say that it's clearly Homo sapien as opposed to the Hobbit people out in Flores Island in Indonesia.
Uh-huh.
And also given that there is proof of that the genus Homo seems to be quite hybridizing as well in many cases. There are a number of people that have got quite a significant amount of Neanderthal, or they got a significant amount of whatever. And it's like, so who was first? Or you go the other way and say, who's the first documented? And it's like saying, well, then, in that case, why is Israel not where Egypt was? Because they lived there for a long time, unwillingly, and then their sky ferry got them lost for 46 years on a 6-month march. So why would you believe that sky ferry rather than somebody else?
Well,
and it's the usual. It's the
Here's
usual
a-
atheist argument of there are 3,000 plus gods. I'm just atheist on all of them. You're just atheist on all but one.
Ricky Gervais.
Yeah, amongst others.
Yep.
Was it him originally? Even I'm not even sure. But
because we've only got a few minutes left and we haven't had our West Wing quota reference, here's our chance to say, Charlie, they don't want us to have our map
Yeah.
yeah,
and hang it on the wall.
Yep.
You know, it's like here's a map of Israel from 600 years
1800
ago.
or something.
God, I saw one from somebody posted one from 1947. I say, see, it doesn't say Israel at all. It says Palestine. Just shoot me in the head.
Well, that's it's one of those myths too that if you want to ignore a lot of this science and anthropology and the culture, so everybody thinks there's this, you know, Anglo-Saxon culture that exists in England, and it's not a massive admixture of dozens of types of people over millennia moving in and moving out. And even if you only look at the last, let's say, 1,000 years, maybe in a little change, you have the Angles and the Saxons moving in. You have, and you can't even say Dutch, Swedish, or Norwegian, Frisian moving in. You can only say really Scandinavians, and Vikings is not really a word that's used in academic circles anymore because it's a pejorative. But you have Scandinavians moving down and in. In fact, most people, if you ask them in northern on the coast of northern France, there's a place called Normandy, and it's called Normandy because they were Norsemen or Northmen who came down from Scandinavia, invaded, took over, and part of those Norsemen were the ones who invaded England in 1066 and took over.
Well, and to complicate things, married local women, you know, who raised their children. And so what happens to the culture then? Yeah, I really like this book by David Reich, Who We Are and How We Got There, or Here. Yeah, I guess it's Here. I miswrote it. Because because this is like really, really recent. This is after the full genome. So this isn't just Svante Pääbo's, mitochondrial DNA, Neanderthal connection thing, which was monumental enough as it was, but this is like the next step beyond that. So, so this is about, so the big, and the big players in Europe, of course, are the Yamnaya, right, who come in and completely wipe out in England, completely wipe out the people who built Stonehenge. So there are these cultures overriding each other in these spaces, which is just interesting.
But even in you mentioned Anatolia, also known as Turkey. When it was Anatolia, there were no Turks. They were all 1,000 miles east, right? And so, one of the things that I see here more than I ever used to back in the UK is Kazakhs and Uzbeks, and you say, "Who are you?" and they say, "Oh, we are Turkic." So, you're Turkish? No, we're Turkic, not Turkish. They're the ones we kicked out. And it's like,
yeah. It's really, it's really interesting. I don't particularly, I like to think of myself in a sort of a 20th century, Western nation state context, as Italian, right? But and I haven't had any genetic work done, but my family has, and so I kind of know that it's there's a little Italian, there's a little Greek, there's a little Eastern, kind of generalized Eastern Mediterranean, and then little bit of English on my mother's side, which is probably a big scandal.
Well,
But
but even at that, then, do you identify as, 18th century Italian, or do you sub-identify as Etruscan or as a
right,
Latin,
right,
or
right.
and
We used
how
to be
far back?
yeah, well, and the Etruscans, because they were so mysterious, we used to sort of identify, because my mother's people are from, we think of it as the north, because it's near the Abruzzi forest, but it's not that far north. I mean, people that I've met who are actually from the Turin area think of Rome as southern Italy. So, but most of my people were peasants from the deep south, right, from Calabria. And so, yeah, so that's the sort of thing where it's like, okay, yeah, nations come and go. I mean, everybody conquered Italy, right? So, so there's Normans there, there's, the kingdom of the two Sicilies, there's just, so many different things.
Are you cisalpine or transalpine?
We are, well, we're actually kind of Mediterranean basin, sort of probably never. I can't imagine those people. I don't know, but maybe I'm completely wrong. But my mental image is of these people just being on the land for millennia, kind of, as the thing that they say about the Mezzogiorno, I mean, and people have kind of made it into a cliche, even like Lampedusa and that nothing ever changes, right? There was a book by, it wasn't by Lampedusa, it was by somebody else, I don't remember, called Christ Stopped at Eboli. And it was basically about the idea that Western culture never penetrated into the south of Italy. So the idea of, and Italy wasn't, Italy became a nation slightly before Germany, but not that much. It was like the 1861.
But even if we stick with our reasonably well recorded Romans, come something like 200 or 250 BC, they still hadn't got the peninsula of Italy as we now know it. They were just that little bit,
mm-hmm.
In the western coast
mm-hmm.
and central east of the boot. They're still fighting the Sumerians and the Etruscans and several others at the same time.
Well, and the Phoenicians who become the Carthaginians, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, you speak to the Christian Lebanese here, they go, we're not Arabs, we're Phoenician. So I go, oh, as beaten by the Romans, and they all shut up. Because it's the it's the funny one with, say, like, if you go through the Henrys with Shakespeare, and it's Henry the second or the third, whichever it is, takes over the bulk during the 100 Years' War, takes over the bulk of Western France, doesn't speak French. Yet Richard I doesn't speak English. Yet he's Duke of Normandy and the whatever of Anjou, King of England, doesn't speak English.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean,
it's all these labels follow the bosses.
He didn't speak what we now call Old English.
But doesn't speak the language of occupied space. And I don't mean occupied in the sense of Nazi Germany occupying the Channel Islands.
Right.
It's the same occupy as though it's like Elon Musk. Oh, I created Tesla.
Martin Van Buren didn't speak English. Martin Van Buren spoke Dutch. So.
And I've got no idea how much English William of Orange.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah. So they were, they probably actually, William of Orange probably spoke to each other in French, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in that whole era of Louis XIV, I imagine everybody, French was the lingua franca.
Yeah. If not Latin.
Yeah.
Well,
But
administratively, it was all Latin at that time. So,
Yeah, if you went to school.
academia.
here's the problem too: is this is the issue that Socrates had with writing as a technology? Is it's going to make us forget to remember. You
Mhm.
can write it down, and suddenly you can forget it. So, in a mass age where we write everything down to remember it, but then promptly forget it, you have lost touch with all of your ancestors, and you don't know who you are really at the end of the day. You can take a genetic test and make some guesses. So
Mhm.
my genetic test essentially says United Kingdom, a lot more United Kingdom, and then like 1% Italian. And my guess is that 1% Italian is the Romans invading in the first century and a little bit of intermarriage. So there's a tiny bit, but otherwise, the genetic tests aren't specific enough to tell me, do I come from Beaker culture? Do I
Right.
come from La Tienne civilization, or some other something, or where today are where are the Galatians,
Mhm.
and who were they originally?
Mhm.
So you have these people in the Bible known as Galatians, and I guarantee you ask 99.99% of all the Christians on the planet, who were those people? They have no idea.
Mhm.
But they were a Gaulish tribe that moved down into that area and settled and became, you know, paid warriors in some sense.
Mhm.
And they spoke a Gallic language or a Celtic language of some sort, and then assimilated into the area and switched languages as they intermarried.
Right.
But
Right.
where are they today? You don't. Nobody identifies as a Galatian.
Mhm.
Like,
Well, they're
you
adjacent to the
know,
Basques, aren't they?
or would have been originally possibly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Um,
but when you look at indigenous cultures who don't who who may have literacy or who are still pre-literate, a lot of them can identify their culture and people tens of thousands of years.
yeah.
And it's because that's part of their culture, it's who they are.
Mhm.
And they have a better sense of who they are because they don't have writing,
Well, and also
and because of
maybe
their art.
and it may be coincidental that the ones that are successful at that have had a lot of continuity, right, and haven't
Yeah.
been, haven't been, had these mixing events. Yeah, you were born in the Appalachians, right?
I was born, uh, yeah, it would have been
Because there's a
in that
whole
part of South
band,
Carolina.
there's a whole band of people down there who historically have called themselves Americans, right? Who when they were asked for generation after generation after generation what they were, they didn't say I'm German or I'm English or they
Yeah.
were Americans, and for the most part they were English and Scotch Irish, and they were the people, they were kind of the people who came. In the decades just before and just after the Revolutionary War.
Yeah. Well, I was a first generation in that area. My parents were from Illinois, and then
Right.
from there had traveled across from Connecticut, and then,
The Great
you
Melting.
know, I presume a chunk of ancestry was pushed out because of potato famines and
Mm-hmm.
other related. We're not doing well here in Scotland, Ireland, or Wales. Let's
Right.
all move to America where we have a better shot.
Where the streets are paved with gold, man.
Yeah. And potatoes are,
Yep.
dime a dozen.
Yep. Yep. All right. Well, on that note, um, yeah, next week, Graeber. We haven't really chosen how much Graeber. Should we do that just in the moments we have
Oh,
left?
yeah, that's a good question.
Uh, let me open up the book here. You know what? It'll be easier just to look at the book. This is a book that I have in every possible format. Um, so the
Hardcover too?
no, okay, almost every possible format. So if we did the first 3 chapters, Moral Confusion, The Myth of Barter, and Primordial Debts, I think that might give us a good kind of flavor. It's about 71 pages. It might give us a good flavor of kind of the problem that he is oh, I
Yeah,
put
that
it,
could work.
I meant to, oh, that's where that showed up over there on the chat. Debt. I was trying to put it into Kindle and I was like, it didn't take. That's because I was my cursor was on the wrong page. Yeah, that would be yeah, he talks about primordial debt theory and in the 3rd chapter, and kind of the mythological elements of that. The myth of barter before. So the first 3 chapters are kind of the debunking.
Yeah.
That work?
That'll give people a chance to do a little inspectional read of some of the rest too.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, I'll make I'll put an announcement about that in the community page.
So, oh, and I think it was it Pat that recommended this book?
Way to go,
Thanks,
Pat. I love
He's
this
a good
book.
one.
Yeah.
Or at least sections 2 and 3 for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was kind of effusive and chock full of really interesting stuff. And I am going to try to track those people, because I think there are some people in it who sort of bear looking at, not only as examples but also sort of as people who are worthy of being tracked. So cool. All right, thanks everybody. See you next week.
Have a good week.